Scouting Adventures. On today's adventure, I'm going to take you along with me on a scouting journey in an area that I call Pike National Forest Area 1. There are several things that I like about this area. It has everything that you would want in an area to hold game. It has dark timber, it has steep slopes, it has mature timber, it has parks, wallows, bogs. It has seeps, it has streams, aspens, pine, hills and saddles, benches and valleys. All of this contained in an area that is not bisected by trails or roads for at least 50 square miles. Terrain that offers a lot of opportunity to find areas that hold animals and that funnel animals in their movements. As we will find out in later videos, this area holds a myriad of wild game. From this view, you can see some of the diversity of the landscape and forest that I was talking about in the introduction. There are steep slopes, such as here, with dark timber on the north faces, and there are south faces with grassy openings. As well, you can see that there's drainages contained within this area that hold water and have greenery for browse. There are areas such as on the top of this slope which had burned 20 years ago maybe, and now are filled with thick pine trees 10 to 15 feet high. There is dark, mature timber like along this north-facing slope on the left side of the screen. There are also areas that were cut off 10 to 15 years ago in the upper left-hand corner of the screen here, where you can see there were forestry actions being taken. As well as further up in altitude as you move along this drainage, you'll see there's additional parks and other springs and drainages that open up in the top of the screen. So all of this gives us a very diverse landscape, both in terms of the plant and forest, but also in terms of the topography. There are many features here that would help funnel animals through certain areas. And as a result of all of this, I've chosen to put some trail cameras in certain places. Particularly, I put one up here in this drainage, where I found that there was frequent bedding activity along this hill of the left-hand side, as well as there was a regular travel corridor along this hill, feeding on the hill and feeding in the browse down below, as well as animal traffic patterns up through this hill and over across this draw in this direction. So I put a trail camera there, put a trail camera in this saddle, and finally towards the end of the video I'll share with you some of the footage from those trail cameras. So let's get started with our tour. And one of the first things that I'd like to show you is, or that I encountered as I hiked up through here in February, was browsing on the aspen in the drainage. And there was a lot of that all through this beginning section. At the time, I wasn't sure if it was elk or moose. Subsequently, after further scouting in this area, I've determined that if this browsing happened during the late winter or midwinter this was from moose. If it had happened earlier in the winter, perhaps it could have been from elk, but I do believe that most of it was from moose. A lot of this up through here was feeding activity on browse, as well as droppings and tracks. The trail through this area was well worn. This was from animal traffic, which I believe primarily was the moose who would work this drainage and browse on the aspen, alders, and other willows and other type of browse that are in the area, which I actually ended up following because the snow off trail was quite deep, with the exception of these south and west facing slopes. As I got up into this area where the terrain starts to level off somewhat, after you can see the transition here from the slope, and then once you get up to this area where there's this park that opens up, it's somewhat starting to get somewhat level. And as we get up in this area, started finding a lot of animal tracks crossing the trail that I was on, basically from this mature forest on the left hand side over up this hill on the right hand side. And essentially what was happening, or what is happening, is the animals are crossing the valley here and going up this hill or up around the other side of this hill. And here are all those thick pines over here. So I believe it's a bedding and feeding type of transition that's happening. And there you can see some more crossings. This is primarily deer crossing this pathway through here. Side of the drainage, you can see this field is basically covered in grass. Later on, I'll show you some examples that you can see that this is a regular feeding area for deer, elk, and moose during the spring, summer, and fall. Again, there were more deer crossing from this hill on the left-hand side of the trail to the open field, the hill on the right-hand side. And there was a lot of evidence of browsing. I don't know if you can see all these tracks in here, but deer and moose both would meander throughout all of these saplings and feed along this trail and along the drainage. It's just amazing the amount of sign that I was finding. It had snowed just the day before and also a couple days before I had hiked this area. Here there was an area where there was a bed, had been covered over by the previous snow. You can see some droppings there and some tracks. And in other areas I found fresh beds that had been occupied the night before. Here are more tracks crossing. I believe this is moose. Fairly large tracks. Sometimes it was hard to tell what the tracks actually were. I mean, you couldn't get a clear impression because snow would fall back into these, but I could tell from the droppings and the size of the track and the distance of the steps that it was most likely moose. Here's some more droppings. There's also a bed here. Not sure if you can see that. There were several deer and moose beds throughout this area, and some of them were fairly recent. Just want to give you an example of the forest. We have a mix of pines up in here on this hillside, aspen as well. And you can see there's both current feeding there and historic feeding. And as you move up this hillside, there's all a mix of pines and aspen of different age classes As I got into this area, there were more recent beds that looked like they'd been occupied just the previous night or in the morning before I got to this point. And you can see there was a moose bed here, there are moose droppings there, and then the tracks go off. And there were several beds in this area. Here's another one. This one looks like it's slightly covered over with some snow, so maybe it was from the prior day. And here's another bed, and this was pretty fresh. This one I think might have been a deer bed. There were both deer and moose beds in these areas. There's another bed, and I believe that was a deer. As I get up into here, I was finding several deer rubs, and I say that because they were on smaller size saplings at a lower level. I believe this is a crossing area for the deer. From the hill on the left side, you can see there's a lower saddle, and across this valley here and then up into this valley, I found evidence that there was a lot of deer bedding happening in these thick woods on this east slope of this hill. There are more rubs, deer rubs throughout this area right in here. In here you can see that there's quite a diversity in the age class of the forest here. You have mature pines, younger, smaller firs, as well as younger, lodgepole pines and aspens and different things mixed in throughout here. Here's another deer rub. There were several of those on these small saplings right along this valley here. Another one in close proximity. And then I had come across fresh deer tracks that looked like deer had been there just the morning of my hike. And perhaps I even had startled them from their bed. Here you can see they bound through these steep snowdrifts as they left their bed. So something startled them, either before I had arrived or perhaps as I approached. In this area, I found more moose sign. There are tracks where they had been crossing the drainage here. And then also I found several beds. This was a bed that had been snowed over. It's partially filled in with snow. A moose bed that I believe they'd used, a couple of nights prior. And the same thing there was an older bed. Here's some droppings, and the moose had been traveling here across the drainage, browsing on these willows. As we get up here, I saw that there was a lot of activity of animals basically crossing this saddle, coming out of this thickly grown, cut area, and coming across the valley here and up this hill. So this is a view across the valley along the side of the hill. And here are moose droppings and fresh tracks. It was obvious that there had been a lot of animals milling around in this area. These are my tracks, the trail that I had walked. The snow in this area really was quite deep. It's not that apparent from this image, but what had happened is basically the moose had been traveling along this drainage this snow underneath was packed down, had some hard crusting in it that I could walk on. If I were to step off the trail over here, I'd go in over my knee. So I basically stayed along here till I could cross the drainage. And then on the south and west slopes of the hill across the drainage, the sun obviously had worked on the snow, so it made it easier for my walking. Here's some moose tracks crossing the valley. And then as we got up in the hill, it's obvious that this is a regular feeding area in the spring, summer, and fall when this grass is growing. There were droppings throughout this area along the hill that were from different time periods. It was obvious that it's used regularly for feeding, although most of these droppings that I was finding here were not fresh up on this hillside. These were older droppings of deer, moose, and elk. And this is a view from the hill, from partially up the hill. Down below in the snowy areas where we had been hiking and we crossed, you can see the area where the forest had been cut up in here. And it just gives you an idea of what the terrain looks like and what the area is like. This is an example of some mature ponderosa pine that had survived a previous fire that it went through several decades ago. Again, adding to the diversity of the forest. So we have both mature trees as well as saplings and browse, and open parks and fields and marshes. And then looking back across the valley from where we came, down along the bottom of this hill, on the other side of this drainage is the track that we'd walked up. And this is just a view looking back over to our right. You can see this saddle that comes through here. And as I come over here, I found this well-worn trail. It looked like there were several animals that had come through a couple days prior, because the tracks were filled with snow, but it was well beaten down. So I thought that this would be a good place to put a trail camera, which I did. So then I proceeded to follow the trail along the hill, and I found a series of beds that had been used, both the previous night and probably, 2 nights before. Really a number of them, quite a lot of beds in these areas, recently used, which assured me even further that I should put a camera in the saddle. And here are more tracks and droppings. Another bed here. And another bed. Actually, looks like they were feeding on browse here as well. And here's another bed. This is a view out to the field, just below that bedding area. You can see the animals from their bedding area along this hill can see out into this field along this draw. Basically can see anything coming before it gets to them, and obviously, can easily find escape routes. And then as we go up the hill here, this is the view looking back. Bedding area is up in this hill, and you can see all the tracks, animal tracks down below coming out of here. both deer and moose. And at the time I wasn't sure if maybe it was elk, but I think in February this was primarily moose and deer that are in this area. As I moved up through this valley, through this next saddle, finding deer tracks through here. This seems to be an area that is frequented by the deer. Along this, below this hillside here to the right, is where there was a previous fire in those thick pines. And it seems to me that the deer radiate out from that area. So here was the signs of a pretty good game trail, maybe a migration route, or a trail that they travel often when they're here. This had, again, it snowed just the day before. This is melting from the sun in the afternoon, but well-worn game trail there. I found more moose tracks and droppings. And again, another example of the forest and the diversity of the forest. Here are some deadfalls in front of me. These were from what had been killed in that fire. There are some of these even still standing, even though it appeared the fire was a very long time ago, probably at least a decade or 2 decades. Some of the forest that wasn't burned by the fire, as well as new forests. Another example of the diversity of this forest, a mature ponderosa pine. There are several of those along this hillside, mixed in with the grassy areas. And here you can see as well, mature pines, young aspen, young pines, and grassy fields. And then across the valley on the other side, you can see there's thick dark timber there. Now I'd like to share with you some of the results, trail cam footage. The first trail cam results that we will review will be for a location I call the Old Wallow. And at this location, the frequency of the visits appear to be around mid-morning and late afternoon. I had a trail cam installed at this location starting March 11th. We'll review the activity through 5/28. There were a couple of times during this period that the camera was not working properly, so there are a few gaps in the coverage. The first activity for elk occurred around the 3rd week of April. Towards the end of May, the activity picked up to a daily basis. trail camera footage that we'll review is also for the period of March 11th through May 28th. And this is for a location I call the Saddle. This area is wooded and well shaded on the northeast slope. It was snowed in. This year we had several snows in February, March, and into April. The first appearance of elk at this location was in May. This was the first appearance of bull elk, as you'll see from the footage. After the elk started appearing, they would generally appear every few days. Here's a preview of the activity you will see in the next episode on these trail cameras, as well as 2 new cameras that I installed at locations that I call Bear Valley and Gulch Crossing.